Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the strangest and most terrifying chapters in human history. A time when people were trying to fight an invisible enemy without even knowing that invisible things could even exist. Imagine waking up early in a medieval city just before sunrise. The streets outside are beginning to wake up. Bakers are preparing bread in stone ovens. Merchants are opening wooden shutters, horses pull carts over rough roads, and church bells slowly ring in the distance. Everything seems ordinary. Everything feels familiar. People walk through narrow streets talking about work, family, food, and small everyday problems exactly like they did yesterday. But then someone quietly says, a family nearby has suddenly become sick. At first, nobody pays much attention. Illness is common. Fevers happen. People recover. Life moves on. But then another family becomes sick, then another, then another. Suddenly, the same conversations begin appearing everywhere. A neighbor who looked perfectly healthy yesterday has not left his house all morning. A merchant did not open his shop today. Someone heard that 2 people on another street died during the night. Rumors spread quickly, and rumors become fear even faster. Before long, people begin looking at one another differently. A simple cough suddenly feels dangerous. A sneeze creates uncomfortable silence. People start paying attention to every small pain in their own body. A headache suddenly becomes suspicious. Feeling tired becomes alarming. A slight fever becomes terrifying. And slowly, something invisible begins spreading through entire communities. The strange thing is that nobody understands what is happening, because medieval Europe lived in a completely different world than ours. There were no microscopes, no laboratories, no germ theory, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. People had absolutely no idea that tiny organisms too small for the human eye could enter the body and cause disease. To them, sickness felt mysterious, almost supernatural. Disease seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear without explanation. Sometimes entire villages suffered while neighboring towns escaped untouched. Sometimes strong, healthy people died while weaker people somehow survived. There seemed to be no clear pattern. And when human beings face something frightening that they cannot explain, they naturally begin searching desperately for answers. Some believe strange movements of stars and planets were responsible. Astrologers looked toward the skies and announced that unusual planetary alignments had poisoned the air itself. Others believed earthquakes had released dangerous vapors from beneath the earth. Religious leaders often believed humanity was being punished for sin. Perhaps people had become too selfish. Perhaps society had offended God. Entire communities gathered in churches, praying for mercy, while fear quietly entered every part of everyday life. But people also noticed something else. The places that seemed dirtiest and smelled worst often appeared connected with sickness. Medieval cities were crowded places. Streets were filled with animals, smoke, food waste, sewage, and countless unpleasant smells mixed together into one giant cloud of discomfort. Houses stood close together, drains often ran through streets, and sanitation was not exactly a top priority. So doctors looked around and reached a conclusion that actually made sense according to the knowledge available at the time. Bad air causes disease. If terrible smells surrounded sickness, then terrible smells must be creating sickness. This became known as the poisonous air theory. People believed dangerous, invisible clouds filled with corruption floated through cities, poisoning anyone who breathed them. Looking back today, it sounds strange. But without microscopes, you cannot see bacteria. You cannot see infection. You cannot see fleas carrying disease. But you absolutely can smell garbage sitting beside a street. So the smell became the enemy. And once people believed bad smells caused disease, the solution suddenly seemed obvious. Fight bad smells with good smells. Soon flowers and herbs appeared everywhere. People carried lavender, rosemary, mint, sage, thyme, and sweet-smelling plants beneath their noses while walking through town. Wealthy people carried beautiful perfume containers filled with herbs and spices. Others burned incense inside homes, hoping the smoke would purify dangerous air before it reached their lungs. Entire cities suddenly looked like extremely nervous gardens walking around on two legs. Imagine people rushing through crowded streets, holding flowers directly under their faces, while desperately hoping they had discovered the secret to survival. Of course, none of this actually stopped the plague because the real enemy was not floating through the air waiting to be defeated by lavender. Tiny bacteria carried by fleas were continuing their work completely unnoticed. But fear changes human behavior in powerful ways. Because when something terrifying begins taking lives all around you, doing something feels safer than doing nothing. Even if that something is carrying flowers through the streets, while invisible danger quietly continues moving among everyone around you. The fear only continued growing because as days passed, people stopped seeing the sickness as something distant happening to strangers. Now, it was entering their own streets, their own homes, and sometimes their own families. Entire neighborhoods that had once been loud and crowded slowly began changing. Shops opened later than usual or never opened at all. Marketplaces that once echoed with merchants shouting prices now felt strangely quiet. People no longer stood close during conversations. Neighbors looked at one another with suspicion instead of comfort. Every sound carried a new meaning. A cough, heard through a wall, suddenly made people nervous. Someone walking with a feverish face caused others to step away. Even ordinary life itself started feeling dangerous. But while fear spread through the cities, doctors were under enormous pressure because people expected them to have answers. Physicians were supposed to understand sickness. They were supposed to explain why people were dying, and more importantly, how to stop it. Unfortunately, medieval medicine had a very difficult problem. The doctors were trying to solve a mystery while missing almost every tool needed to solve it. They had no understanding of bacteria, no concept of germs, no antibiotics, and no scientific testing methods. So like humans have always done throughout history when faced with something terrifying and confusing, they relied on the knowledge they already had. That knowledge centered around an ancient medical belief called the theory of the four humors. According to this idea, the human body contained four important fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health depended on these fluids remaining perfectly balanced. If a person became sick, doctors believed one of these humors had become excessive or corrupted. So naturally, if illness meant imbalance, then treatment meant restoring balance. This idea had guided medicine for centuries, and nobody saw any reason to question it. So when the plague arrived, doctors looked at their patients and believed the body itself had become disturbed internally. And if something inside the body was wrong, then something inside the body needed to be removed. That brought them to one of the most famous treatments in medieval history: bloodletting. Suddenly, physicians across Europe began removing blood from patients in hopes of restoring harmony within the body. Small knives called lancets opened veins, while bowls collected flowing blood beneath them. Some doctors preferred using leeches, tiny creatures perfectly designed for extracting blood while quietly doing their work. The amount removed depended entirely on the doctor's judgment. Sometimes only a little blood was taken, sometimes far more. The problem, unfortunately, was that plague victims were already fighting desperately for survival. They suffered from severe infections, high fevers, exhaustion, dehydration, and overwhelming weakness. Their bodies needed strength. Instead, many of them lost even more energy through blood removal. But from the perspective of medieval physicians, the treatment seemed logical because they were not trying to kill patients. They genuinely believed they were helping. Removing corrupted blood looked active and intelligent. Doing something always feels better than standing helplessly beside someone who is suffering. Meanwhile, another strange figure slowly became one of history's most recognizable images: the plague doctor. Imagine already feeling weak and terrified while lying in bed with fever. You hear footsteps approaching outside your door. Then suddenly, a tall, dark figure enters the room wearing a long coat, gloves, a wide hat, and a mask with a giant bird-like beak stretching outward from the face. Through small glass eye openings, a pair of eyes stare back at you while the figure carries a wooden stick in one hand. Comforting probably would not be the first word entering your mind. The famous beak mask looked almost supernatural, like some giant bird creature had decided to practice medicine. But doctors actually designed it with a purpose. Once again, the explanation returned to poisonous air. Since physicians believed dangerous vapors entered through breathing, they decided the nose needed protection. Inside the long beak, they packed pleasant-smelling herbs and materials like lavender, rose petals, mint, camphor, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloth. As air traveled through the beak before reaching the doctor's face, it supposedly passed through these fragrances, where harmful vapors would be purified. Looking back now, it seems strange, but within medieval understanding it was considered intelligent design. And surprisingly, the outfit accidentally created a small amount of genuine protection. The heavy clothing covered most of the body, reducing direct contact with patients and making it harder for fleas to reach skin beneath the layers. Without understanding bacteria or insects, plague doctors had accidentally stumbled into a primitive form of protective clothing. Not exactly modern medical equipment, but far better than walking directly into infected homes wearing ordinary clothes and confidence alone. Many doctors also carried wooden staffs, which served several purposes. They could use them to examine patients without touching them directly, lift blankets, point at symptoms, or gently move people without close physical contact. Again, without realizing it, they had accidentally created something resembling distancing practices. But despite these accidental successes, fear continued spreading faster than understanding. Because every morning people woke up hoping things would improve, and every morning more church bells rang across cities, announcing new deaths. Streets became quieter, homes became darker, and everywhere people looked, uncertainty waited beside them like a shadow that refused to leave. As the weeks turned into months, fear stopped feeling like a temporary visitor and slowly became part of everyday life itself. People no longer woke up expecting normal days. Instead, they woke up wondering who would disappear next. Cities that once felt crowded and alive now carried a strange heaviness hanging over them. Doors remained shut for days. Windows stayed closed. Streets that had once echoed with merchants, horses, and conversations now felt quieter than anyone could remember. The silence itself became unsettling because silence in medieval cities was unusual. Normally, there was always a movement, always noise, always life happening around every corner. But now, many roads looked almost abandoned. Some people refused to leave their homes unless absolutely necessary. Others left quickly with flowers pressed beneath their noses, walking faster than usual as though moving quickly could somehow outrun sickness itself. Every stranger suddenly looked dangerous. Every crowd became suspicious. Even simple human interaction started feeling risky. But while ordinary people struggled with fear, doctors continued searching desperately for answers because admitting complete ignorance was almost impossible. Society expected physicians to understand illness, so when one treatment failed, another quickly appeared. Soon medieval medicine entered what could only be called its experimental phase. If bloodletting did not solve the problem, perhaps stronger methods were necessary. One popular treatment involved heat. Lots and lots of heat. Physicians believed the plague was connected to cold, damp conditions poisoning the body. Therefore, warmth and dryness should restore health. Patients were instructed to sit near roaring fires for long periods of time. Rooms were heated heavily. Windows remained closed. Some doctors even recommended extremely hot baths and steam treatments designed to force illness out through sweat. The logic sounded simple. If bad influences entered the body, intense heat could drive them away. Unfortunately, plague victims already suffered from severe fevers. Their bodies were already struggling under dangerously high temperatures. So placing someone burning with infection beside a large fire was not exactly ideal medical care. Imagine suffering from a terrible fever, and someone deciding the best solution is to place you closer to even more heat. But medieval medicine often relied on balancing opposites. Cold conditions required warmth. Wetness required dryness. The reasoning followed philosophy more than biology. Patients sat sweating beside fires, believing the disease was being forced from their bodies, while the real cause of illness continued quietly spreading unnoticed. And then came vinegar. Medieval Europe suddenly developed an almost unbelievable confidence in vinegar. If bloodletting was medicine's favorite solution, vinegar was probably its second favorite. Doctors believed its sharp smell and cleaning properties could neutralize dangerous poisonous air. So people began using it everywhere. Hands were washed with vinegar. Furniture was cleaned with vinegar. Cloths soaked in vinegar were held against faces while walking through city streets. Some individuals even bathed in vinegar, believing it would cleanse sickness from their bodies. Imagine already feeling weak, exhausted, feverish, and terrified, only to be told that your treatment today involves soaking yourself in something that smelled like extremely aggressive salad dressing. To be fair, vinegar does possess minor antibacterial properties. It can help clean certain surfaces and reduce some contamination. But the plague bacterium was not politely waiting on chairs and tables, hoping someone forgot to wipe them down. Once infection entered the body, vinegar was not about to change history. Still, people continued using it because it gave them something precious during terrifying times. Control. Humans desperately want actions they can take when life feels uncertain. Even if those actions involve turning entire cities into giant pickling projects. As fear continued growing, people also began noticing one particularly frightening symptom appearing on many victims. Painful, swollen lumps emerged around the neck, armpits, and groin. These swellings, later called buboes, became one of the most recognizable signs of the plague. To medieval people, they looked horrifying because they appeared almost like physical evidence that poison itself was building inside the body. Naturally, doctors wanted to remove that poison somehow, but without surgery, antibiotics, or any understanding of infection, solutions quickly became strange. Very strange. Some physicians recommended bizarre transference treatments based on the idea that disease could somehow move from one thing into another. If illness existed inside the body, perhaps it could be transferred elsewhere. This belief led to unusual practices involving animals and other materials being placed directly against plague swellings. Certain treatments suggested applying live animals against infected areas, believing the poison would leave the patient and enter something else instead. The theory seemed simple from their perspective. Disease had to go somewhere. If it left the body, perhaps recovery could begin. Of course, bacteria completely ignored these theories because bacteria generally do not care about symbolism, rituals, or human confidence. The illness remained exactly where it was, while confused animals suddenly found themselves participating in medical procedures they definitely had not agreed to. Yet despite all these strange treatments, there was something deeply human hidden beneath them. These people were not foolish. They were frightened. They were watching friends, neighbors, children, and entire families disappear without understanding why. They were living in a world where invisible enemies had not even been imagined yet. And when human beings stand in darkness, searching desperately for answers, they reach toward whatever hope they can find. Even strange hope feels better than hopelessness. So medieval doctors kept trying, families kept praying, and cities kept waiting for relief, while an invisible disaster continued moving silently through Europe one street at a time. And then something even stranger began happening. After months of fear, endless treatments, prayers, strange cures, and desperate attempts to understand what was happening, people slowly started noticing a terrifying reality. The plague was not behaving like an ordinary illness. It did not care whether someone was rich or poor. It did not care whether someone lived in a small village or inside a wealthy city. It did not care how many flowers a person carried beneath their nose, how much vinegar covered their clothing, or how many herbs had been burned inside their home. Kings heard about it, merchants feared it, priests prayed against it, doctors struggled against it. But the sickness moved forward with an almost frightening indifference. Entire communities watched powerful people become weak, and ordinary people disappear without warning. For perhaps the first time in many places, society was witnessing something that ignored status completely. Wealth could buy larger homes, expensive physicians, and unusual treatments, but wealth could not simply order the disease to leave. And that idea felt deeply unsettling in a world built around strict social order. People reacted in many different ways. Some became more religious than ever before. Churches filled with crowds hoping prayers would bring protection. Entire groups traveled from town to town, believing acts of public suffering and repentance might convince heaven to show mercy. Others became convinced that hidden causes were responsible and began searching for someone to blame, because fear often creates suspicion before it creates understanding. Rumors spread rapidly. Strange stories moved from village to village. People whispered about curses, conspiracies, and punishments. In times of uncertainty, the human mind desperately wants explanations. And when real explanations are missing, imagined ones often rush in to take their place. Fear has a way of creating shadows, even where no shadows exist. Meanwhile, everyday life itself was changing. Markets no longer felt normal. Celebrations became smaller or disappeared entirely. Families learned to live with uncertainty hanging quietly over ordinary moments. Imagine sitting beside loved ones at dinner, knowing that tomorrow nobody could say with confidence what would happen next. Imagine hearing church bells ring in the distance and immediately wondering whether another neighbor had died. Imagine waking up